Liberty Hall. Out of this building our army marched to join the Greencoats in the GPO, next door to the Metropole Ballroom, where, 40-odd years later, my parents would waltz me into being. Late at night, I squint into a tiny screen, trying to spy on my parents' romance, watching Fred Astaire, how he danced with Ginger Rogers and Sid Charisse. I imagine what they were like, cosplaying Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor. He certainly as sardonic, she just as beautiful. The dresses, the suits, the cigarettes. On her wedding day, she stood on the pavement outside the Mead Street Hospital to show herself to my father's father, dying contagiously inside. Every day now I walk that potholed street and look up at the dusty windows, where sometimes I think I glimpse him, liminal as Harold Bloom's Gnostic Psyche. And it's as if I'm looking down at his pale tubercular face, like a painting I saw of a drowned Syrian refugee stepping through a blue door. He never got the button job as promised, but laboured in the malthouse. Jamesons and Guinnesses, the twin liquid nirvanas of the Dublin working classes.
That was today's Toaster Challenge guest, poet and author Michael O'Loughlin, reading from Liberty Hall, the title poem of his new book, which will be published by New Island Books later this spring. Michael O'Loughlin was born in Dublin, graduated from Trinity College. He's published 6 collections of poetry: Stalingrad, The Street Dictionary, Atlantic Blues, The Diary of a Silence, Another Nation, New and Selected Poems, In This Life, and Poems 1980 to 2015 from New Island as well. He's translated extensively from Dutch, Spanish and Catalan, including Hidden Weddings, selected poems of Gerrit Achterberg. His own poetry has been translated into many languages, and his short fiction has appeared in the Picador Book of Contemporary Irish Fiction and the Scribner Book of Irish Writing. And he's also written screenplays for feature films, including Snapshots. He's now based in Dublin, but he's lived in Barcelona and Amsterdam as a frequent traveller, and indeed that travel and the places he has lived in and visited have had a major influence on his work. Michael has had lots of residencies. He's been poet in residence at the Frost Place in Franconia, in writer in residence in Galway. He's had stints in Riga, Prague. He's been writer fellow at Trinity College, Dublin. He's a member of Aesthona, the Irish Association of Artists, and he's a frequent contributor to the Irish Times and other publications. And we'll come back because he had something in the Irish Times just the other day, which we might have a quick chat about. It's been said of his work that the poems he's written for more than 3.5 decades constitute European poetry in the mask of English, and they're a unique addition to the capital of letters. So, Michael, you're very welcome. And I mean, the main reason you're here this morning is to talk about your forthcoming book, Liberty Hall. It's an unusual book in a way. It mixes prose and poetry. It's very much a book about Dublin, but what we call Europe also features heavily: Amsterdam, Paris, Barcelona, Prague. So where did the initial impulse of the book come from? Did it grow organically from poems and prose, or is it a kind of concept album? Did you set out to write a book called Liberty Hall?
Well, it's both, because I did set out to write a book called Liberty Hall, but the initial impulse came from sort of an experience I had where one day I was walking across the Liffey and Collins Street Bridge, and I looked towards the sea and I saw Liberty Hall, and I just read that morning in the newspaper that it was going to be knocked down. So I started writing a poem about the knocking down of Liberty Hall, but then they never knocked it down. So the poem then became something else. It became a poem about something that didn't happen. It kind of started to deconstruct itself. Mm-hmm. And the actual poem, Liberty Hall, which is a long poem at the end of the book, that kind of grew out of that experience. But then the overall book, it did start with a title because I wasn't working towards a particular book. And after I'd published poems 1980, 2015, I felt very liberated. I felt, well, I've done that. That's that. And now I want to do something completely different. So the book contains poems, prose poems, a memoir, photographs, paintings, and an essay from 1991, which kind of is a sort of a commentary on what's gone before, even though it's
Sure.
chronologically later. So Liberty Hall, for me, has lots of different connotations. First of all, it's a building, and a lot of the book is about architecture, and architecture as memory, frozen memory. But it also has an historical connotation, because Liberty Hall is where the 1916 Rising started. And when I was a child, because my parents were trade unionists, I was often in Liberty Hall. So it also has an emotional thing. But above all, the most important meaning is the Dublin expression, you're in Liberty Hall now. You can do whatever you like. So when I started to put the book together, I was thinking, well, I am in Liberty Hall. I can do whatever I like. If I want to put in a photograph, I'll put in a photograph. If I want to write a poem and then stop the poem halfway through, I'll do that. So it is very much a concept. I don't think, not all the poems were written specifically for the book.
Sure.
It's kind of like sinking an archaeological shaft down through a burial mound. You get different layers. There's a poem in it from 20 years ago, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I like what you, because there's an epigraph from Louise Bourgeois at the beginning of the Liberty Hall, where you talk about memory itself being a form of architecture, and because obviously,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, Dublin, as you say, is at the centre, but it's not just present day Dublin. I mean, you're very interested in origins. It's your father's Dublin, even your grandfather's city feature as well, you know, throughout the book, and in what you call this film poem.
Mm. Well, yeah, I'm actually trying to tell the story of the family through the architecture. And when I say the story, I don't mean the things that actually happened to them as such. I'm trying to look at what was the emotional weather in the family. And I just noticed something strange happened. I was born in the Rotunda Hospital on the north side of the river, but my parents were living in Camden Street, not far from where we are now. So my very first journey was across the River Liffey from north to south. And weirdly enough, I've been rehearsing that journey all my life, because when I went to Trinity, I was living in Finglas, so every day I crossed the River Liffey. And crossing a river always has a kind of a ritualistic quality. And the long prose memoir is about a bicycle ride from Camden Street to Coleraine Street on the north side, with my father, sitting on my father's bike. And it's kind of like, as we passed through the various buildings, the various streets, his life and my grandfather's life and my grandmother's life and the great-great-grandfather's life are all associated with certain streets. So it's kind of like architecture is, during the Renaissance, they used to have these memory palaces. So
That's right.
Louise Bourgeois said, you know, architecture is a form of memory, but memory is also a form of architecture. It's true both ways. So this traveling and this ritualistic movement around the city is very important for me. As I think as is for you, moving and cycling around, kind of psychogeography of the place. But I'm trying to take it a bit further and bring it back 100 years.
Sure. I mean, sometimes Dublin's it doesn't always feature in a kind of positive light. I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, you know, sometimes Dublin's a city that's kind of reluctantly returned to. I'm thinking of the lines, now we have returned against our will to put our heads once more in the tiger's jaws, paying a king's ransom to live in a duke's stable, Mahan evicted, Hartnett dead, and you resolved never to leave the island again.
Yeah. I came to live, I lived in Amsterdam for about 20 years, and then I came back to Dublin for a couple of years, and I really couldn't settle down. I really didn't like being here. So we went back to Amsterdam, and weirdly enough, after a couple of years, we were kind of drifting back towards Dublin because my daughter wanted to go to school here. So we came back to Dublin, and it was a terrible time, 2002, and the country was just completely going insane with rising prices and kind of political corruption and the banks and the mortgages and all this kind of stuff. It was a bad time to be in Ireland. So yeah, Sarah was 16 at the time. This poem was written on, 2002. So yeah, I didn't have positive feelings about Dublin at that particular time.
Just to go back, because just turning to that experience you mentioned about, because you mean 20 years is a long time. You spent 20 years in Amsterdam, and I mentioned that you had a piece in the Irish Times this week about the difference between Ireland and Holland in the context of the Dutch kind of riots against lockdown and so forth. And you were making the point that we don't riot, the Dutch do. Are there any other differences? I mean, how did Amsterdam strike you as a city compared to Dublin?
Well, actually, there's an essay. The essay from 1991 was written uh, in the context of Dublin being the cultural capital of Europe. I don't know if you remember that.
Yes, I do indeed, very well.
And the point I actually used, I think I actually used a sentence in the essay where Amsterdam was presence, Dublin was absence. That Amsterdam had the culture, it had the opera houses, it had the symphony orchestras, it had the museums crowned with paintings. It was a solid cultural city. Whereas Dublin had a lot of art, but didn't really have the culture for reasons of history. So they were like mirror images of each other. So very, very different. And as you were pointing out the piece I wrote in the paper a couple of days ago, because the book's called Liberty Hall, I'm thinking about liberty quite a lot. Mm-hmm. And well, you lived in Amsterdam as well, and you know this conception that the Dutch have of individual liberty, and it's a very Protestant conception. Yeah. Because every man has his bike, the Staten Bible, translated into Dutch, and he's able to read God's word, and nobody else can tell him what it means. Yeah. And so I think at a certain stage, Amsterdam, the expression in Amsterdam was, everything is permitted, nothing is compulsory. And I think if you spend 20 years in the place, that culture becomes sort of internalized. So I find that the Irish, though we're supposed to be the great freedom fighters, the Irish are not that interested in individual liberties. They're interested in the more social kind of aspect of it.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting. I mean, and yet at the same time, because there's a very interesting essay at the end of the book where you interrogate, and something actually you kind of do this throughout the book as well, but you interrogate what cities mean to you, and it's like, the search for the ideal city, or as you mentioned, Mandelstam's nostalgia for world culture, and you're often disappointed in that search. Like you say, Paris is too French, Barcelona is too Catalan, Amsterdam is too Dutch. Are there any truly cosmopolitan cities left?
I don't know.
Okay.
As you mentioned, I spent some time in Prague a few years ago. I was there for a few months, living in a kind of a soulless Soviet suburb, high-rise. And it was very interesting because Prague was a centre of European culture for a long time, and then it came to an end. But it's a city of Rilke, a city of Kafka, and so forth. But it had a kind of a weird feeling now because it was full of kids from all over Eastern Europe and Southern Europe and Americans. And it's actually, Prague is now, even though it's my friend, the poet Silva Fischerova, she says, Prague is just like Dublin. It's a provincial metropolis. And the strange thing is the provincial metropolises seem to be emerging rather than the big cities. The book I'm going to talk about in the Toaster Challenge is Roberto Calasso. And he's an interesting theory about this, that there were great cities. Paris was a great city in the second part of the 19th century. Vienna was a great city at the first part of the 20th century, but since then there hasn't really been any. So I think the centre you're looking for is very hard to find.
That's interesting. I mean, you have a piece about Paris, and I like there's a lovely bit in it where you're talking about being obviously in Rue des Irlandais, and you get a taxi home, and you say and you tell the taxi driver who's Senegalese where you want to go, and he says there's no such place as Rue des Irlandais, and you said yes. Moi je suis Irlandais. This is my street.
Yeah. See, I like being Irish when I'm not in Ireland.
Yeah.
It's always useful. Interestingly enough, that the Rue des Irlandais, it was the Catholic Church, the bishop, who changed the name. It used to be called Rue de Cheval Vert, the Green Horse, which is the famous magazine edited by Pablo Neruda in the 1930s in Paris, El Caballo Verde. Weird connection.
Okay. So, Michael, just remind us, Liberty Hall is coming out from New Ireland, and it'll be available sort of around April-ish. Is that it, or is that the?
It should be. It's April is the planned launch. The plan was to launch it in Liberty Hall.
Of course.
But that's probably not going to go ahead at the moment. It may well go ahead later on.
All right. Okay, so now we're going to move you to the Toaster Challenge, that exciting part of the show where you get to talk about a book that has resonated with you for the length of time it takes to make a slice of toast. And so I'm already here with the toaster, and I'm going to put the bread down in a second. So do you want to take us into your toaster challenge?
Yes, the book is called Literature and the Gods by Roberto Calasso. And Roberto Calasso is a novelist and a writer. He's published dozens of books about Greek myths. He's a polyglot, a polymath. He's particularly interested in ancient Greek myth. And his theme in all his books is really myth and modernity. And he's kind of the Italian version of John Banville, in the sense that he sees himself as a Central European rather than as an Italian. And this book, it's a short book, but it's very dense and it's very difficult to summarize. Of course, being a Central European, even though when Calasso says literature, he means poetry, of course. He doesn't mention prose writers. And what the book is about, it's about how the ancient gods are always disappearing and then are coming back in various forms. And the form that they come back in is through literature. Now, he starts off with a fantastic chapter about Homer, of course, because he says, for us, everything begins with Homer. And he gives the example of how the gods were even disappearing during the time of Homer. And theos, the Greek word for God, has no vocative case. So, in other words, we're misinterpreting the myths a little bit, or we're misinterpreting the gods. To the Greeks, the gods were not things, they were an aspect of human behavior. You could say God manifests itself through what you do. So, for example, in the Odyssey, Ulysses keeps meeting Pallas Athena in various guises. But Calasso turns this around. So when he actually meets the shepherd boy on the beach, who is Pallas Athena in the guise of shepherd boy, he's saying, no, that's not true. The shepherd boy is manifesting the goddess in something that he does or says. So he takes this argument right up to the 20th century. To Calasso, the gods come back at the beginning of the 19th century with German Romanticism through OLoughlin and Novalis. And then they continue to manifest themselves through Baudelaire and Mallarmé. And then they move to Central Europe, of course, to Franz Kafka. So he calls this kind of literature absolute literature. And it's literature that is about itself, which is a manifestation of something divine. So he says what all these writers have in common is that they're writing about something that is the same thing, but you can't actually define what they're writing about. So to him, it's more or less, it's what he calls it the divine whisper that's coming through these people. He includes Yeats in this, interestingly, which is, in the Irish context, is fascinating. But what's amazing about the book is the erudition and the breadth and the sort of the level at which he's working. I mean, he's not trying to justify literature in any way, but he's saying this is what we have to do. We have to always stick to the myth, because he doesn't regard modern literature as being an advance on myth. He sees it as being an aspect of myth, that the myth is still there as strong as ever. So he has this very clever way of twisting things around to give you a new insight into the literature you're reading. For example, we think of, if you're thinking psychologically, you think, well, the divine or God is an aspect of your psyche. And Calasso says, no, your psyche is an aspect of this God. So he takes a very, very universal view. And at the moment he's engaged on a project examining myth in the 20th century and how it works out in particular concepts or themes rather than in characters. He's not that interested in narration. And I think he's on book 10 now, and they're regularly published and translated into Italian. He's a fascinating character because he also has studied Sanskrit. So he also translates the Hindu myths and tries to find connections with the Greek myths. There's one great quotation which I'm always using, which is from a Sanskrit text, which says about poetry, meters are the cattle of the gods.
And I'll stop it. The toast is just about perfect at that stage, Michael. It's a fascinating account of a book,
Yeah,
which I'm actually eager because he also wrote, of course, the famous for the marriage of Cadmus
marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. Yeah,
and Harmony,
yeah.
and so that's
Which is a reinvention of the Greek myths, but this is kind of more sophisticated in a way what he's doing now.
yeah, yeah, indeed. And you mentioned and of course Banville has written
Banville has written a lot about him.
About him as
I'm sure
well.
he must be his publisher.
Yeah, the gods have been dying for ages. I remember him saying.
Yeah.
But okay, so thanks very much, Michael. That was Roberto Calasso. And yeah, I have that. So that was Roberto Calasso, Literature and the Gods, and it's published by Vintage Penguin. It came out in 2001 and is still available in a bookshop near you, even if you have to order it online. So thank you again to our guest, Michael O'Loughlin, for coming in today and enjoying the toast with us.
Thanks, Peter. See you on the canal.